Welcome to David and David on Real Estate. Join us as we explore the ins and outs of the real estate market.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the David and David on Real Estate podcast. And we're in the 50s, David. I feel old. It's
51.
episode 51.
I think we should maybe switch to Roman numerals, like the Super Bowl.
Change it up a little bit, make it a little bit different.
I'm not sure if I can count into the 50s in Roman numerals, but
we'll confuse everybody.
Yeah.
But we have a really important topic today, David. And I'm glad you brought this up because, my office is always getting a lot of questions, and this is quite a complex issue. But today we're going to be talking about tenant and landlord issues.
Yeah, on the residential side, things that affect transactions primarily, because that's what you and I are getting questions on all the time. Where you're a seller and it's a tenanted property and you want to sell the property. Are you selling it, subject to the tenancy because the tenant is staying and you need a buyer to assume that tenancy? And if so, what do you do? And that's sort of the easy thing. That's much easier than, no, I'm going to sell it vacant. The tenant's going to be leaving and I'm selling it vacant. So I'm looking for a buyer that wants a vacant property. But what if the tenant doesn't leave? Or how do you make sure the tenant leaves? And what are the rights of the tenants? What are the rights of the landlord? And a lot of people getting into those type of predicaments. So it gets a little complicated a lot of times.
It does, and there's a lot of issues and questions surrounding, who has what rights, including the new buyer of the property and what their rights are, and can they ask for vacant possession and what circumstances? So it's a great topic, and before we get into it, I want to share a story. One of my realtors gave me a call actually yesterday, as it happens, and she did a transaction back in July of 2021. The deal went firm and the property was tenanted. They asked for vacant possession. And I was just made aware that the transaction to this day has not closed because the tenant is refusing to move out and the new buyer is refusing to assume the tenant. So this agreement of purchase and sale is open. The lawyers are communicating. There's an application before the tribunal. No hearing has been scheduled as of yet, from what I'm aware, and everything is in limbo.
So I assume the parties have been extending the transaction. So it's like the closing date, they keep extending to try and get into the tribunal to get a decision. Right, because they could have at some point they could have, one party or the other could have terminated the transaction and walked away because he couldn't provide vacant possession, right? Which is the first point to make. Like, if your agreement says that you're providing vacant possession, you got to provide vacant possession. If you can't, the buyer doesn't have to close. The transaction is not going to close, right? And
Absolutely.
The standard form agreement of purchase and sale says right in the clause that has the completion date or the closing date. It says, upon completion, the seller will be providing vacant possession, right in the printed form. And it says, unless it's otherwise specified somewhere else in the agreement. So as an agent, you got to be careful with that because you might cross that out. So it won't be vacant possession. Or even if you put that in, it's still subject to whatever else is in a schedule. And if the schedule has a clause that clearly says there won't be vacant possession on closing, the buyer is there is a tenant, or there's two tenants or three tenants or whatever it is, and the buyer agrees to assume the tenants, that's got to be very carefully articulated clearly so that there's a clear obligation of the buyer to assume those tenants. Otherwise, they're entitled to vacant possession. So now the seller's got to make sure they get the tenant out.
Yeah, and the responsibility does fall on the seller, right? So, I mean, you got to take a couple steps back, and at the time of listing the property, you have to do a lot of due diligence, right? You have to get a copy of the lease. You have to check if there's a lease in place, if the lease is month to month. You got to make sure that interest has been paid on the deposit that the tenant has given the landlord. And in some situations, if the tenant has been there for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, we're seeing some of those situations, that interest, might be, a number that is contagious, right? And you have to, verify and do some due diligence and make sure that that is addressed at some point as well. And you know what those numbers are.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because when you are closing on a transaction where a tenancy is being assumed, it's not just an adjustment for the current month's rent that you have to do, and you have to do that, and you have to do an adjustment if there was a security deposit of some sort that was paid at a certain time. You have to give credit to the buyer for that. But like you said, you've got to do this interest calculation from the time that the deposit was made until the closing date to figure out what that would be. And there's prescribed rates, how by the government of what the interest you're allowed to, or you're obligated to provide for that. So you have to adjust that too. So it's a lot of homework. So that's a great point, David. Like anytime you're dealing with a property that's going to be so a tenancy, you got to get all your ducks in a row and have all that information before you put your listing out and before you start drafting agreement of purchase and sale, to make sure that you're doing it properly and you're including all those things. There's no surprises to anybody.
I always get questions, and realtors always ask, hey, should I tell the tenant that we're selling the property and that they're going to have to move? And I always answer them, why would you ever have that conversation? I mean, that's not what the law says, and that's not what their rights are. So, I think we need to really talk about that and explain that. So there's only two scenarios where a landlord can provide notice to a tenant and ask them to move out of the property and deliver vacant possession, right? So the first instance is if a buyer signs an affidavit and swears that they're going to be moving in, or their immediate family, and then you have 60 calendar days from the beginning of a month, which is really important to note as well, right? That time period. So if you're giving notice somebody on, let's say tomorrow, you give somebody notice, you'd have to start counting the 60 days from the 1st of July.
Right.
Right.
Right. And you got to be very careful with calculating the days in the notices that you're giving, because any flaw in that, you're always going to be doing it on the basis, well, what if there's a dispute and you're going to the landlord and tenant bureau, what are they going to hold up? And if there's any technical flaw in the notice that you gave, for sure you got no chance to win anyways, right?
Zero chance. And then you're starting the whole process from zero.
You start over.
You're waiting 6 months for the trial date.
Right.
So it could cause some major delays, right?
Yeah.
But the point here is that at the point of making the decision to list the property for sale, you could never in a million years anticipate that the person who's buying the property will need it for personal possession, right? So that conversation with the landlord should never really be had. Sorry, with the tenant should never really be had, right? So, I mean, you can say to the tenant, hey, there might be a situation where the new buyer requires the property for their own personal use, but we will know that in the future. And we'll keep you abreast, and we'll let you know what the intentions of the new buyers are. But until you get that buyer to the table, and until they sign an affidavit claiming that the property is going to be for their use or their immediate family, you really have no idea if you're going to have legal grounds to evict that tenant, or even have that conversation and ask them to leave. So that's really important. We're seeing
really important.
We're seeing a lot of agents not really understanding that, right? Like they got the listing right away. They're talking to the tenant and they're saying, hey, you're going to have to move. We're listing the property. Not true at all, because the Residential Tenancies Act basically states that if an investor buys the property, they really have no legal grounds to ask the tenant to leave unless they're doing a substantial renovation of the property. And in that instance, the actual tenant would have the right of first refusal when the renovation is completed at a increased rental rate.
To come back.
Exactly.
Right. And that's really important too. And you've raised some great points here, but I always, we talk about law and legal rights and stuff like that. And I always like to come back to the practicalities too, when you're dealing with this stuff. So you've got a tenant that's in there. So you have to accept the fact that tenant has some rights. Okay. Now, is it a bad thing to tell a tenant, well, I'm the owner, you've been a great tenant, or you've been a lousy tenant, doesn't matter, but I'm looking to sell the property. Like, there's no obligation to tell the tenant that, but sometimes from a practical point of view, it might make sense to tell them, because sometimes the natural buyer of a property is the tenant. Okay, especially tenant's been there for a while. They've been in, let's say it's, usually it'd be a good tenant who's actually looking after the place and maintaining it, because they take a little pride themselves in the property. Sometimes they're a natural buyer. Like, so sometimes it's like, why shouldn't you talk to the tenant that loves the place and doesn't want to move out, and you can't get rid of the tenant anyways? Maybe they want to buy the property. So why not have that conversation in some instances just for that reason alone? But aside from that, you have to, and they say, no, I'm not interested, but I love being a tenant here. And tenant knows you're not getting rid of me. I'm staying. So now what? Okay, so now you're going to do your homework. You're going to be listing the property and you're going to be selling it subject to the tenancy. Now, you might have to have a conversation depending on the property. Like you said, what if you think that anybody, the place really needs a renovation, and you think that anybody that's going to buy this property might go that route and do a substantial renovation. So then you say to the tenant, look, potential buyer might do a substantial renovation. You might get a notice. You might have to move out for a year, go somewhere else. And yeah, you'll have a right to come back, but you've already moved out. Are you really going to want to come back? Maybe it's just move out once, find another place. Let's pick a reasonable time, give you plenty of notice. Let's pick a date and sign an agreement to end the tenancy. Sometimes a landlord will even throw a sweetener in. If you agree to, because parties can always contract out of their lease, whether it's a month-to-month lease or a fixed term lease. The landlord and tenant can always just come to an agreement saying, hey, we agree to end this tenancy on August 1st, and whatever terms they agree to. And sometimes the landlord might say, you know what, I'm going to give you some free rent for a couple of months if you agree to leave, and you sign this form under the landlord and tenant. So you have to leave by that date. And if you don't, we can go to the tribunal and get an order to get you out. So you're agreeing to leave, and we can agree on those terms. The landlord, might throw in something, cash payment or a couple months free or something, because it might be worth their while to get a tenant to agree to leave. But you have to understand the tenant has rights, and you might be able to negotiate something off those rights. Otherwise, you have to respect those rights, because if you're trying to trample those rights and you walk into the tribunal, no chance.
Yeah, and the tribunal has been really tough on landlords and agents who, aren't respectful to those rights and advise their clients outside of those rights as well. So, realtors have to be very careful what advice they give their clients as well. And I completely agree with the practicality of these situations, Dave. And we're seeing this a lot, and we call it cash for keys, right? It's a concept called cash for keys.
Yeah.
And it's gained massive popularity lately because, tenants are understanding what their rights are, right? So, we've seen really crazy property appreciations, and a lot of landlords are cashing out, but the other investor that's coming in and buying the property, also understands that, hey, I don't want to move in here, right? And maybe I don't want to do a substantial renovation, and I want vacant possession because that gives me the ability to have, control over who's in my property. But more importantly, market rents in today's environments are way higher than they were 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Right. And if investors are paying a higher price for these properties, they need more monthly cash flow to cover the additional debt that they're incurring by purchasing. Right. So a lot of the times they want to get a new tenant where they control the terms and they control the market rents. And the only way to do that is to get vacant possession on closing. So the concept for cash for keys has been very prevalent. And I've seen situations where, landlords had to pay over $10,000 to a tenant to get them out and ensure that closing happens on time and everything goes very smoothly.
Yeah, and in some scenarios, that's a good investment.
It's
Like, that's money well spent sometimes.
Yes.
Okay. What we're also seeing, like, that's sort of the proper way to do it. What we're also seeing is a lot of fake attempts or fraudulent attempts, whatever term you want to use, to get tenants out by trying to use one of those two methods to get rid of a tenant, by either faking that a buyer needs it for their own purposes, for their own family, when it's not true, because they want the tenant out. And sometimes it's just the buyer doing it. Sometimes it's the buyer and seller working together to try and do it, and it's very dangerous. Or faking that they're going to do a substantial renovation, get the tenant out, and then they just paint the place and put a new tenant in, and they don't do that substantial renovation, right? So people are constantly trying to scheme around the Residential Tenancy Act to find a way out, okay? And I always, my role is to tell them what the law is and tell them to be careful. And let me just read something to you, okay? The purpose of the Residential Tenancy Act, because I can't paraphrase it better than I could read it. The purpose of the Residential Tenancy Act: to provide protection for residential tenants from unlawful rent increases and unlawful evictions, to establish a framework for the regulation of residential rents. And then it says to balance the rights and responsibilities of residential landlords and tenants, and to provide a process for adjudicating disputes, etc. So the second part of the sentence says to balance the rights and responsibilities of residential landlords and tenants. It doesn't start with that. Like, here's a board is created because we're looking out for landlords and we're looking out for tenants. No, it says the primary purpose is to protect tenants from unlawful rent increases and unlawful evictions. That's the primary purpose. And secondarily, we're going to try and balance the rights of landlords too. So if you're a landlord or an owner, you got to know that. So anytime you're going to the board asking for something, you've got to have all your I's there. You got to have all your T's crossed. You can't screw up on your notices, your dates, you're completing, everything's got to be perfect. You have to have clean hands. They can't get a whiff that you're trying to do something sneaky or fraudulently or fake or any of that. And if you come with all that, there's a good chance you lose, because they never want to throw a tenant out on the street. Even if they have to evict a tenant hasn't paid rent for months, tenants trashing the place, tenants disturbing other tenants. They get all this evidence. A judge is still going to say, tenant, can you be a good guy? Can you be a little nicer? Can you clean up your act? Can you make a payment? How much time do you need to catch up with your rent? And how much time I'll give you some time. Okay, let's give you 60 days or 90 days to fix up the place. And then we'll give you some time to do it. It's the middle of winter. We're not throwing you out in the street. They're always bending over backwards to give that tenant more time, even though the landlord is right. The landlord was a good landlord, going by the letter of the law, doing everything right. They're still going to lean towards the tenant. So you have to know that.
They protect the weaker party. Like, that's really what the Residential Tenancies Act is about. It's protecting the party that has less power, less say.
And that's all pre-COVID. Right. With
And
COVID, it's even.
It's always, it's always the really bad landlords that ruin it for the good landlords, right? And like when you look at history, like I'll give you an example. One of our staff members at the office is a renter, and the landlord came in and turned off their AC unit in the middle of last summer. I can't remember why. And I think it was because the mother came to visit for a couple of weeks, and the landlord didn't like that there was more people occupying the property than on the rental agreement. But they arbitrarily came and the furnace room is locked, so they turned off the AC. And for a period of I think 2 months, they had no AC. But in that situation, I agree that the landlord should be taken to the landlord and tenant board and should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of that situation. But by the time, they made an application to the board, summer was already over.
Right.
So,
Right.
I mean, looking at some of these conditions and these rentals, I understand why the law would be written the way it is. And you bring up an excellent point, in that paragraph, when you look at, why the statute was written, it was the rights of the landlord are secondary to everything else. And that's the way it's really written. On the residential side, I would say that the majority of the law favors the tenant, unfortunately. Tenants have rights.
Right. And even when the tenant's wrong, the judge is generally still going to give them an opportunity to fix it. But the first issue that you raised, David, is there's a timing issue. Like you think, okay, oh, I'm a landlord, and we're not trying to discourage people of becoming landlords and owning investment properties and things like that, because you deal with that a lot in agent, and you're always talking about doing that and everything. Like everybody should do it. Like don't be discouraged, but you have to know what you're doing. You have to have the appetite for it and know what happens, because you say, okay, residential tenancy act, so that's great. So I know I got to have a standard lease, and we complete a standard lease, and you do that. Now you got a tenant. And if there's a dispute, okay, I go to the tribunal. And if I'm the good landlord doing everything right, I'll go to the tribunal and I'll get the tenant to move out if we have to, or I'll get the tenant to pay his rent, or I'll get the tenant to fix whatever they're supposed to fix. And the tenant thinks the same way about the landlord. If the landlord's turning the AC up, I just go to the tribunal and I'll get an order for the landlord to do it. But you can't go like the next day to get in there. Like it's months and months and months sometimes to get in there. And then you go there, and sometimes another party says, oh, I'm not ready to go today. Can I get an adjournment? They get an adjournment. There's a way to stall it out. And look at the situation you raised. Like it's been a year already for you've got people with a transaction keep extending, and they haven't been able to get there yet. So that's a bit of a flaw in the system, because it's not like you can apply the next day and go in and see a judge and get an order. Like it's a process.
Yeah. A lawyer once told me that it's kind of like private healthcare and public healthcare, right? And once you go into the court system or into the system, then you're really at the mercy of the system. So it's always better to solve your issues directly with the tenant. It's that whole practicality of the law that you mentioned, cash for keys. I mean, you can always have an agreement outside of what the contract is, and you can contract out of it. So I would encourage everybody to, use that as their primary means of navigating any of these situations. I think being amicable and talking and really leaning on the relationship you have with your tenant and the landlord is the number one way to resolve all these disputes.
It is. And look, if you can offer the tenant some alternatives, like if you're a real estate agent involved in this, and you say, look, we're trying to sell this, we want to get the tenant out. But if you can also present that tenant some options, first of all, we're going to give you some time. We're not going to give you like 10 days and you got to get out of here and you have no idea where you're going, because obviously they're going to say no to that. But we're going to give you a reasonable period of time. But by the way, here's 3 or 4 properties I want to take you to go see.
100%.
That you might like even better than where you are, and the rates are comparable, or it's a better rate, or maybe it's more, but you're getting more for it, or right? Like give them some practical options. They don't know the market. They're sitting there thinking, oh, I got another, year on my lease, or I got another few months, or I'm month to month. So no one's getting rid of me. I can stay as long as I want until I get a notice. But give them some options and explain the market to them. Like, those are the practical things that you have to do, I think, to try and get an agreement. Okay. Now, having said that, landlord and tenant can negotiate agreement. You can say, okay, I'm giving you $10,000. You agree to leave August 1st, and they sign that. Now you've got an agreement to end the tenancy, negotiated in good faith. Everybody signs it in the correct form. It's all done properly. You're still holding your breath till August 1st to make sure that they get out, because, I couldn't get out. I couldn't get a moving truck. I need a couple more weeks. The place I'm going to wasn't ready yet. I have to paint for all kinds of excuses. So even though people agree to leave in a certain date, sometimes they don't. And again, your recourse is, no, you agreed to leave August 1st. It's now August 1st. You haven't left yet. I could go to the residential board and get an order to evict you. And let's say you do get an order, then that has to go to a sheriff who has to attend. You got to get the sheriff there. Like, it's a whole process. You're not getting them there on August 2nd still. So it's still an issue. But you're reducing your risk, at least, because you will get them out if they sign that. As long as they signed it in good faith and it was done properly, you will get them out. It's a question of when. And more often than not, you'll get a tenant, they'll cooperate at that point, because they received money, they received time, they know where they're going, there is a plan, right? So at least there's the plan. They know they've got a place to move to, and they know when they're moving, and they got enough time to do it. So then you got a good chance of getting them out, right? But you got to all this in advance.
Absolutely. And I think, talking about best practices, right? When you get that N11 or N12 signed, well, N12 doesn't need to be signed by the tenant, but N11 is a form for mutual understanding to end tenancy. When you get that form signed by the tenant, the minute it's signed, I always encourage all my realtors to file it with the landlord and tenant board the day it's signed, right? So,
Yep.
as you're waiting for 60 days or 90 days to come to an end, if you're noticing that the tenant, there's a chance that they're not going to cooperate, you're already 3 months in and you're way, ahead of that time period, and you can, expedite the process of getting the landlord and tenant board involved to make sure that they honor that agreement that was reached. So that's a really good thing to do. Whether you have a good relationship or not with the tenant, go ahead and file that paperwork. Make it, make it a formal process, and that way you're just a couple months ahead of the necessary time period if things do go south.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. And I would even let the tenant know that you've done it. Okay. I think you have to make it a formal process, because the tendency is to try and make it more buddy, thanks for cooperating, we'll send some email confirming you're leaving and we wish you well and blah, blah, blah. But I think you have to go formal on this so they know that the clock is ticking on them.
Yep.
And that they have to get out. There's a legal obligation to get out. And if they don't get out, there's going to be consequences to them, which could include, getting an order for some costs against them issued because they're the party not cooperating and everything. Now that's harder in, in residential tenancy situations. Like judges don't want to hammer tenants for those type of costs, but potentially they are. If they're abusing the system, eventually it'll catch up to them too, right? So I think your advice is great, David. Like, you got to make it a more formal process. Here's the forms. They've been filed. It's been submitted. And just to give you a reminder, that you have to be out by that date, and how's it going? Anything I could do to help? Oh, I'm having trouble getting a mover. Oh, okay, here, I'll get you some names for some movers,
Yeah.
like whatever you could do to make the process easier for them. Like, it's good for everybody, right?
Good for everybody. And speaking of making the process easy, I just want to take a step back because we haven't really talked about this, but at the time of listing the property, I think it's so important that you actually take the time to go and meet with the tenant and really drive home that relationship. Bring them something small, maybe like a bottle of wine or a gift card to a restaurant. Look, at the end of the day, this is the place where they live. This is their home, right? And no matter how good or how professional you are, there's always going to be an element of inconvenience to having other people walk through their space and to show their space to, other potential buyers, right? So I think it's a great practice to, give your tenant a $50 gift card and say, look, I know there's going to be showings. I know that, during dinner time, there might be people here. You won't be able to, probably sit down with your family, have a meal because there's showings going on. So look, I wanted to give you a $50 gift card, go and have a meal on me. And this is a small token of our appreciation of your cooperation and something small for the inconvenience that you're going to feel. That's going to do wonders to,
Yep.
Allow people to come in to, maybe the tenant's going to say, you know what, you didn't give me 24 hours, but you've been so good to me. I don't mind if somebody comes and sees the place tonight. Right. So
Right.
making sure that you have that solid relationship with the tenant from day one is so important, because if you get that wrong and, the tenant doesn't want you in their space, the tenant keeps refusing appointments, the tenant, says, hey, we have COVID every week for the next 25 weeks in a row, good luck getting in here. You're going to make life a lot more difficult for yourself. The other advice I have is spend the money upfront and make sure that you get the best property tour you can get. Do a 3D property tour, do a video walkthrough, get as much multimedia as you possibly can at the very beginning, so that if a situation arises where, the tenant does get COVID or stops allowing showings, you can still show the property virtually, which, you can still move forward with the sale and still market the property to potential buyers. I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, that's a really important thing too, because, if you look at it, selling a tenanted property is no different than selling an untenanted property. There's a whole bunch of potential buyers that want to see it. And then once they're interested in, then they want to get an inspection. They want to come back for an inspection. And now let's say they're the successful buyer and they've signed an agreement to take it over, even though they're buying it subject to a tenancy, they still might have to get their lender in for an appraisal. Okay. They still might have to get certain contractors come in because there's things that have to be fixed. Even that if it's stuff that's for the benefit of the tenant, there's still a bunch of these visits that may have to happen just in the normal course of the transaction. And each one of those is a disruption for the tenant. And the tenant say like, there's nothing in this for me, or all it is a disruption, right? So you've got to be mindful of that. And like you say, find a way around it. So you have to have that relationship to let them in and say, look, we know there's going to be an inconvenience no matter what. We're going to try and minimize it. We're trying to give you as much notice as we can. We're going to try and keep the visits as short as we can, but there's going to be some of this. And occasionally we might have to ask for something that is shorter notice than we'd like to give you. And you have the right to say no, and we'll try and reschedule it. But sometimes I might, we got to, wash each other's backs, so to speak. And, and maybe you offer them something like every time, we ask you to go out for 2 hours, we're going to give you a gift certificate. So you're going out for supper each time. Here's a $50, go get a meal for 2 hours and then come back. Right. You've got to be mindful of it because you need that cooperation from the tenant.
You do. One of my realtors listed a property that they knew they're going to get a lot of action on at the height of the market. And what they did is they listed it on Thursday and they were accepting offers on Sunday. So they actually paid for the tenant to go into a hotel room for 4 days. They had a small kid. Right. So they paid for a hotel room. It was around the corner from where the house was. The hotel cost $150 a night. That opened up the slate that they could show the house at any time from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. They didn't require 24-hour notice. And, there was zero inconvenience to the tenant and their 6-year-old daughter. And it was, a fantastic way to handle that situation and to make it a really good experience for everybody involved.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. It really is. The other thing you got to look at, like how much time, if you're selling an untenanted property, as agents these days, you're always telling your clients to declutter the house. And then we're going to do some staging, right? Like that's become part of the norm of selling a property these days. But now go and try and do that when there's a tenant there and the place is totally cluttered. And even if the tenant's agreeing to leave and is at a certain day, you're selling it, so it's going to be vacant, but the potential buyers are walking into a place that hasn't been staged and it's not decluttered. And it might be a way better place than it's showing because of those factors, right? So ideally, you'd like to be able to go to the tenant and say, hey, do me a favor, can you clean up this mess a little bit? Or I got people, we got showings coming up. Can we try and do something? Or we want to bring in a couple pieces of furniture to do some staging, and you can use that stuff for a while, but we want to move out some of your garbage. Like those are hard conversations to have. Right.
But they get easier if you have a great rock solid relationship with the tenant. Like they really do get easier, right? If you have a bad relationship, then they're impossible conversations to have.
Yeah.
So David, let me ask you this question. Say you've done all that and say the closing day comes and you're supposed to get vacant possession, but for whatever reason, out of the control of the tenant is still in the property. What happens next?
Well, your recourse, you can only get rid of them by getting an order through the tribunal, the landlord and tenant tribunal, to get an order to evict them. And, because they're not complying with one of those notices that they've been given, depending on whatever one it is, and they're supposed to be out. And then you get an order, and then you still have to be able to just because you have an order, you show up, oh, here's an order, or you send it to the tenant or the judge hands it to. It doesn't mean they're moving out the next day either. So, and the order might be, it's not the next day. Sometimes it could be, but it might be an order you got to leave, in the next couple of days or whatever the order says, but you still have to enforce that order too. So you got to get that order in the hands of a sheriff, because the landlord's not allowed to show up and grab the tenant by the shirt and say, here's the order and I'm pulling you out of the house and I'm getting rid of your stuff. But you can get a sheriff to do that, basically to enforce that order. But all of that takes time, and it takes some effort and obviously some money too. So you have to be able to be prepared for that process. And I could tell you something too, like my law firm, we're involved all the time on buying and selling properties subject to tenancies and dealing with these type of issues we've been discussing, but we don't go to the tribunal. Okay, we're not doing that type of work. There aren't a lot of lawyers that actually do that kind of work. It's usually done mostly by paralegals that hang around the courts, and they're there all day, and it becomes worth their while at some point. And the reason the lawyers, you just generally can't charge enough, and it's not worth the while for the lawyers to do it. Things get adjourned. There isn't enough money involved, and the system is designed so you should be able to go without a lawyer. Okay, it's designed so a landlord and tenant can walk in on their own, just like small claims court. Up to a certain threshold, you can sue each other without needing a lawyer. So that's why the system was designed. Okay. Now I would tell anybody, like, if you can get a paralegal to go help you, someone that's there all the time, that knows the ins and the outs and knows how to get on a list and knows, that might have some advantage. Like, you're better off doing that. And it's a good investment to get a paralegal to do it. Because you're going to have a lot of trouble finding a lawyer to actually attend for one of these things. So we don't do it. Okay. You can do it on your own or get a paralegal to do it, but get one that's there all the time, that's really specialized in these, because they can tell you exactly what the timing's likely going to be, what your chances of success are, and they'll make sure that the forms are all completed properly as well. Okay, because that's the first thing a judge is going to look for. Did you miss filling in the form properly? Oh, good, easy one.
Yeah.
Start over again, come back when it's all signed properly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So in that case, David, like on the technical form, would you be extending the closing, and what are the obligations of the parties to work with each other, to work through those extensions? Like, if the seller says, no, I want out of this deal, the tenant's still there, like, what are the responsibilities of both parties to work through those issues? If closing date comes and the tenant is still there.
Yeah, look, the written agreement governs, agreement of purchase and sale. If it says you're supposed to get vacant possession on August 1st, and on August 1st, the seller can't deliver vacant possession, the buyer doesn't have to close. There's no obligation on the buyer to assume the tenancy. Now, that is something that can be negotiated, though. Okay, and we see that all the time with an agreement. They're saying, you're disclosing everything. We've given notice to the tenant's supposed to leave by August 1st. And here's evidence that we've done it. And even there's an agreement to leave, but just in case they don't, sometimes you can negotiate a term where the buyer says that the buyer agrees if the tenant's not out, the buyer agrees to assume the tenant. And then either the buyer's going to take over the process of getting the eviction, but they'll get the rent in the meantime, but they close and they take over the process. Or sometimes it's negotiated, yet the buyer agrees to assume the tenant and close, but the seller post-closing is going to continue with, it's still the seller's obligation to pursue this through the board to get rid of the tenant. Okay. And maybe there's a holdback of funds involved to make sure that the seller does that. Or if the buyer's taking over, sometimes it's negotiated that if they're not out, buyer's going to close, but maybe there's an abatement in the purchase price by $10,000 or whatever the number is, because the buyer's now going to spend money and take over the process to get rid of the tenant. But these are things that can be negotiated one way or the other. Okay. But it has to be negotiated and agreed to in the agreement. In the absence of anything like that, you get to the closing date, tenant doesn't move out, buyer doesn't have to close. Buyer says, sorry, I want my deposit back. I'm going to go buy something else. Okay. Now, sometimes we get to those situations and the buyer really wants the property, and we can negotiate an extension at that point in time because they don't want out of the deal. Maybe the value's gone up or whatever, but they want to go ahead with the deal. So now it gives it in the situation that you're in, the one you mentioned, like they've already extended for a whole year, right? Yeah. And again, you're going to have a negotiation as to what those extension terms are going to be. Okay, like the seller's still paying for it, seller's still responsible for looking after the place, seller's still insuring it and everything. You're just doing an extension, or is the buyer coming in to do any of that stuff? Is there, you're negotiate, you have to negotiate the terms of an extension and come to an agreement.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting conversation, because I brought that up with the agent in my conversation. And I said, how are you guys, handling things like, property taxes and some expenses in that time period. And the agent was like, well, I didn't think of that. And I said, well, has rent been collected? Is the landlord collecting rent? Yeah, I think the tenant's paying. Okay, well, you have to ensure that rent's been being paid. And if rent has been paid, well, then the landlord got the mortgage offset that's being paid off by the tenant. And there's probably enough money there to pay property taxes. So really the landlord, had an advantage over the last 10 months. And maybe they're going to agree to the extension with no other costs incurred by the buyer, and everything's going to remain at same. And if you go through that negotiation, that conversation, that's going to make the most sense.
Yeah, we're running into it to one of the issues with a buyer agreeing to an extension these days is that mortgage rates are changing on us so fast. So we've got situations where the buyer is saying, okay, if there's a short extension, if it's 30 days or something, I'm okay because I've got a mortgage commitment. As long as we can't close August 1st, but as long as we close by September 1st, I got the same mortgage. I'm locked in at a certain rate. So there's no real cost to me as a buyer for giving you that month, so let's do that. But if we don't close by September 1st, my mortgage commitment expires. And now to get the same mortgage that I wanted for this property is going to cost me more money. The buyer's actually incurring a different cost for the next 5 years on their mortgage terms. Okay. Yeah. So if the buyer is going to agree to any extension beyond September 1st, they're going to say, like, if I'm agreeing to anything, then seller, you got to cover me for that interest rate differential that I'm going to be facing, because it's your problem that we're not closing on time, because the tenant's your responsibility. You can't close. So if you want to keep us going, get an extension, you got to cover me for that cost. And right now, like, that's a real cost. If we were had this conversation a year ago, that wouldn't be as big as a factor as it is right now, because we've seen these increases in mortgage rates, and there's more coming, we think, right? And that's a big factor.
Yeah. David, lots of great topics we discussed today. I think the message here is a consistent one. Have a great team of professionals helping you through these processes. Seek expert advice. If you're unsure, don't tackle it yourself, because there's real big issues here, and tenants have big rights, and you have to be very mindful how you navigate some of these tough situations. Talk to David Korman. Come talk to me. We're happy to guide you through these. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in and hanging out with us. And next week, actually, David, we have an investor who's going to be talking about rent to own and the benefits of going through some of those models. So I think it kind of ties in with our conversation today.
Yes.
And I'm really looking forward to having him on. His name is also David, so we're going to have 3 David.
Oh no, David and David and David.
But thank you, everybody.
Looking
Enjoy your week.
to it.
We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
All
Have
right,
a good
bye-bye.
week.